The rise and fall of progressive rock, 1969 to 1979. When I look back at the progressive rock scene in the 1970s, it was quite utterly mad, completely bonkers in fact. We had aeroplanes crashing into stages, keyboard players who either stuck knives into their instruments or played adorned in flowing gold capes, singers balanced on one leg while playing the flute and sporting the latest style in codpieces, drum kits that weighed in at a whopping 2.5 tons, triple live albums, concept albums whose lyrics had been supposedly written by an 8-year-old genius, 40-foot inflatable pink pigs, and concept albums performed on ice rinks. And that's just for starters. Prog could be pompous, overblown, pretentious, utterly ridiculous at times, but it still managed, despite all of that, to produce some of the best music you'll ever hear. Welcome to the weird and wonderful world of progressive rock. My mates and I were huge fans back then and followed the scene religiously, scanning the weekly music papers for news of the next release, the next tour, or just what was the next piece of gossip. King Crimson, Genesis, Yes, Tull and Pink Floyd. They were the top dogs, the bands you had to follow if you were a dedicated progger. Then you had the fringe contenders, your Gentle Giants, your Focus, your Procol Harum and many others. And they made some great albums, but those 5 were the elite. Back then you could always spot the dedicated progressive rock fan. They were ringers for Ian Anderson, BC, before Codpiece. But you had to be right on your game, because every now and again at a party or around your mates, someone would produce the Inner Mountain Flame by the Mahavishnu Orchestra and try and pass it off as prog. You'd shake your head and sadly look at this errant son. Nah mate, what you got there is your jazz fusion. It's not prog. Or someone would try and catch you on the hop and pass you a copy of the latest PFM album. And you'd study it and you'd slowly say to them, yeah mate, that's your European progressive rock. If you listen closely, you'll hear these overtones of neo-Italian realism, suffused with essences of Dvorak and Tchaikovsky. Not bad son. Walking away, my mate Steve said, I didn't know you were a PFM fan. I said, I'm not, I've never heard them. So for me, the heyday of prog was around 1969 to 1979. Those were the days when the kings of prog ruled the world. But the musical climate changed, some lost their way, others changed and adapted, others carried on as if nothing had happened. So I thought with this video series I'd like to go back and look at those golden years. And the way I'm going to do it is I'm going to do one video for each of those top 5 bands. Tull, Yes, Genesis, Crimson and Floyd. The first time I saw the words progressive rock was on the sleeve of Caravan's first album. But for me, the day it all started was July the 5th, 1969, when King Crimson played Hyde Park. No one had heard anything quite like that. It was a sonic assault, a bit like seeing the Sex Pistols for the first time. It was only a few weeks later that Jethro Tull released Stand Up and Yes released their first album. But back then it seemed everyone was waiting for Crimson to release their first album, and out it came on the 10th of October 1969, and it was the game changer. It set the bar for everything that followed. I think it was the first time we had heard classical music, jazz, folk, rock and experimental music all blended together in a way that didn't sound clunky and clumsy. Pete Townshend at the time called it an uncanny masterpiece, while Robert Fripp said he didn't want Crimson to ever sound like any other band. The album reached number 5 in the UK and number 28 in the States. So the springboard for a long, stable and successful career for the band? Not in the world of King Crimson. Members started to leave, come back, play on sessions and leave. Greg Lake announced he was off to form a supergroup, ELP, Emerson, Lake and Palmer. By the time the next album came out, in the wake of Poseidon, only 2 members were left, Robert Fripp and Pete Sinfield. The record went to number 4 in the UK charts, the UK album charts, but it left Fripp and Sinfield having a hit record but without a band to perform it. At one point, Elton John actually auditioned for King Crimson. Captain Fantastic and the Crimson King? Maybe not. For all the upheavals, Poseidon is not a bad album. The title track is wonderful and so is Cadence and Cascade. But at times, as many reviewers have said over the years, it veers a little too close to sounding like In the Court of the Crimson King. Next up, Lizard. Crimson had recruited Gordon Haskell on bass and vocals and drummer Andy McCulloch. But during the recording of Lizard, both Haskell and McCulloch found it difficult to connect with the music being produced, and both left. The press release for Lizard quoted from the poem Desiderata on how to chart a true course through confusion. Robert Fripp has been very critical of the album, calling it unlistenable, and people who like it, very strange. Lizard finds the band moving very much more into jazz avant-garde and chamber music, and despite some of the music produced sounding uneven, it has some stellar moments, most notably Side 2, which is taken up with the title track, Lizard. It opens with a very young sounding John Anderson on vocals. It's another brave, bold attempt by Crimson to take music forward and live up to that title, progressive rock. Though by now some of the impact and attention the band had garnered from their incredible first album was beginning to wane. Lizard only reached 29 in the UK album charts and only 113 in the Billboard charts. I can't remember Crimson touring at all at this time, and they seemed by a lot of people just to be regarded as a brilliant band, but also as this strange kind of oddity, a band whose albums you approached with extreme caution. Islands, 1971. Not too well received by critics at the time, but personally I loved it. I loved the music, I loved the cover, the Trifid Nebula in Sagittarius. For once, an album cover reflected the music inside. At the time Islands was released, I was heavily into the music of Miles Davis, and the orchestral work on this album reminds me of Miles' work with Jill Evans, especially the title track with Mark Sherrick on cornet. Prelude, Song for the Gulls, is just simply beautiful. Elsewhere, the musical explorations and extended compositions are just superb. It's one of those albums you have to put time and effort into for it to give up its gifts. After touring with Islands, Fripp found he was on his own. Mel Collins, Buzz Burrell, Ian Wallace and Pete Sinfield had left for whatever reasons. Robert had said that he now wanted to move more towards music like Bela Bartok and free improvisation, so no likelihood of any hit singles or appearances on Top of the Pops in the near future. But with all of Crimson's upheavals, it seemed as a popular band and one of the pioneers of prog, they were falling way behind bands like Yes, Tull and Emerson, Lake and Palmer. But fear not, Mr. Fripp had a few tricks up his sleeve. He managed to lure away Bill Bruford, the drummer of Yes. Bruford, who thought Crimson would be a better place for his musical expression. A BBC documentary on Crimson once commented, "This was akin to going over the Berlin Wall to East Germany. No papers required, just extreme chops." Bruford also remarked at this time, "Everything you've heard about King Crimson is true. They say to you whatever you did before King Crimson, would you please not do it here? Almost nothing was said about the music and how to construct it. You were just supposed to know. Fripp also brought in John Wetton from Family, David Cross on violin and mellotron, and the percussionist Jamie Muir, a man I might add who was in part responsible for Yes's Tales from Topographic Oceans, but that's another story. So what did Mr. Fripp have in store for us? What he had for us was an absolute masterpiece. Lark's Tongues in Aspic. Or should I say 3 masterpieces. Lark's Tongues, Starless and Bible Black in 1974, and Red also in 1974. All the unevenness that had plagued the albums after the Court of the Crimson King, that had all gone, and all the best elements, now they had managed to weld together. The heaviness, the bombast, the beautiful quieter moments, the jazz, the rock, the classical, the free-form improvisation. It seemed at last the Crimson King was on his way back and ready to retake his throne. This was really progressive rock. Everyone was performing at the top of their game, the absolute peak of their powers, feeding off each other. The intensity, especially when they played live, was just incredible. So much so that the bulk of Starless and Bible Black is recorded and improvised live, with the audience sounds erased, as the band felt that Lark's Tongues, though brilliant, did not capture the band in full flight. But even though the band were flying high, all in the Crimson Garden was not rosy. Muir went through a spiritual crisis and decided to quit to become a monk. Fripp also wasn't comfortable. He felt that when Bruford and Wetton were playing live, they played with such volume, he compared them to a flying brick wall. David Cross also felt his playing was being drowned out and left after the 1974 tour. And then there were 3. But as they were recording Red, Fripp also went through his own spiritual crisis and wanted to quit the music business to pursue his own spiritual and personal development. So on September the 24th, 1974, Fripp announced that Crimson has disbanded forever. 2 weeks later, Red was released. Crimson do Blue Oyster Cult was a headline in one of the music papers. But that couldn't be more further from the truth. Although I thought parts of Red were incredibly heavy, it was a long, long way from Blue Oyster Cult. Bone-crushing heaviness and cerebral complexity, said another review. Most of Red comes from improvisation, but not jamming, where one guy takes centre stage while the rest of the band follow established rhythm and chord changes. Crimson's improvisation is where everyone is allowed to make creative decisions and contributions while the music is playing. Everybody solos and nobody solos. It's a tightrope walking act, and without supreme musicianship, it can sound absolutely terrible. So, after making 3 incredible records, Crimson were no more. But Fripp was to return, and Crimson still exists, even today. Though Robert doesn't like the term progressive rock, King Crimson were and are probably the only band who came from those early days of progressive rock and actually kept on progressing, constantly exploring new musical ideas and new musical textures. Fripp was to release a solo album, Exposure, in 1979. It's an extraordinary album. It's a bit like a musical CV. It's called Exposure, and if you haven't heard it, it's well worth checking out. I'll be covering Robert Fripp's solo career in depth sometime in the near future, and his work with Bowie, Eno and Peter Gabriel. So, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed the video. It's just my thoughts and my memories on that extraordinary time in popular music. Parts 2, 3, 4 and 5 will be uploaded very soon. So I'd love to hear your thoughts, and if you have any memories of that time, please put them in the comment section below. Stay well, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next video.